Dear Professor Richard Swinburne, thank you very much for accepting to give this interview, and on behalf of Central Research Institute of Spiru Haret University, I want to thank you again for the interesting lecture entitled The Problem of Evil you delivered last Friday at our university. For the beginning, allow me to show to our audience some details about your education, visiting professorship, appointments, research activity, and to present some of the books you have written so far. Talking about books, I would like to start with Providence and the Problem of Evil, and the book entitled Providence and the Problem of Evil, and the lecture you delivered at our university, and to ask you, why does a loving God allow humans to suffer so much?
Yes. If we weren't worried about this, there would be something wrong with us. We understand by a good being someone who loves someone and will not want to hurt them. And if God is in charge of the universe, we suffer a lot, and naturally we are puzzled. If we're not puzzled, if we don't think of that as an objection to God, then there's something wrong with us morally. But let's take an analogy. Suppose you see someone sawing off a poor person's arm and the person is screaming, and you think the person who is sawing off this arm must be a very wicked person. But you then learn that the person whose arm is being being cut off is suffering from gangrene, and the only way his life can be saved is by sawing off his arm. And then you think the surgeon is not a very wicked man, but must be a very good man to do this. And I think it's like that with God. If we reflect on what are the good things for human beings, we shall come to see that the only way some of them can be promoted is by allowing humans to do harm to each other and allowing them to suffer in various ways. The first thing to remember in this context is that according to a Christian, our life is a limited life. It's for 80, 70, 60 years, but that is part of an eternal life, and God in this world is helping us to prepare for the next world. And he gives us a choice of the sort of persons we should be. And he allows us responsibility for each other. Now, it's a great good to have a choice between good and evil. And it's a great good if our choices make a difference to people. Parents are enormously blessed because they have choices about how they will treat their children, how they will bring them up. And however simple and ordinary parents are, they have immense choices. And that's a great good for them. But they can't be responsible for children unless it's really up to the parent what happens to the child. If my only responsibility for the child was to whether to allow him to study French or English, or whether to give him this present for his birthday or that present for his birthday, I wouldn't have much responsibility for the child. To be responsible for the child, it has to be up to me whether he has a good education, a bad education, whether he suffers or whether he benefits. And that's a great benefit for me. But I can't have that benefit. God can't give me that benefit unless there's a possibility that I might hurt the child. Okay, but that's a great good for me. It's also a great good for me because by my choice each time, and of course it's not only parents for children, but we all have all sorts of minor responsibilities for each other. Every time I make a good choice, it becomes easier to make a good choice next time. Every time I make a bad choice, it becomes easier to make a bad choice next time. And so I gradually form my character. And God gives us these 80 years, partly because it's so good we should have the responsibility for others, but also because it's so good that we should have the responsibility for ourselves to form our characters. Now, you may reasonably say, very good for me, the parent, rather bad for the child to be at my mercy. Yes, but the child will grow up in time and be responsible for others. But also, it's a great good for us, not merely that we have choices, but that our lives have some use, some value. That's more important than whether we suffer or don't suffer. Ordinary pain is a bad thing, of course, but much worse is that our lives should be useless, and even more worse, that our lives should be immoral or cruel. There are much worse things than pain. And even the child is of use, because the child, by their vulnerability, makes it possible for the parent to have significant choices. And above all, the child makes it possible for God's work to be forwarded, because by their vulnerability they give the parent choices and thereby help God to help form the parent. But not only that, when we suffer, we have choices too. We have choices as to how to deal with our suffering, whether to resent those who cause suffering, or whether to understand that they have problems, they themselves have been badly brought up, and so on. And we have choices as to how to deal with our suffering, and if we deal with it in the right way, then we become saints. And if we deal with it in the wrong way, we become very bad people. And so, whether we are the agents of suffering or the victims of suffering, we have choices. And the choices lead to the sort of people we are. And it's more important that we shall do good things and become good people during 80 years or whatever of life than that we should have a comfortable life where nothing matters very much. And in the scale of eternity, 80 years is pretty small. So if God's to give us significant choices, he must put us in situations of crisis, not all the time, of course, but significant situations of crisis where we can make significant choices which make great differences to ourselves and to everybody else. And if we weren't like this, our life wouldn't matter. But our life does matter, and God gives us a life that does matter. And that, I think, is the primary reason for the suffering.
Okay, thank you very much. I will go further to another book entitled The Coherence of Theism. And I would like to ask you, are the words used in theology being used in the same sense as when they are used to describe ordinary, mundane things?
Well, theologians do their best to tell us what God is like. But of course, they also say God is so different from humans that human words are not very adequate for this purpose. And Christianity has always said this. St. Paul says we see, in one of his letters, we see through a glass darkly. We can't fully understand what God is like and so on. But we see, albeit darkly. That is to say, we can have some idea. And in the course of Christian history, various thinkers have given sharper form to this, and the thinker who gave sharpest form was the Western philosopher and theologian St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. And he had a doctrine of analogy, that is to say, a more precise account of how words about God were used. And he says we use ordinary words. Well, of course we do. We say God is good, God is wise, God is powerful. But he says we don't use them in quite the same sense as when we use them of people. To use the Latin term, he says we use them eminentiori modo, that is to say, we're saying God is like good. God is good, and in that respect he's like good humans. But he's much more of eminentiori modo, much more of the sort of character that we're picking out in humans is in him. And likewise, he's wise. Like Socrates is wise, or Plato is wise, but he's got that in a much bigger degree, and we can't understand fully what it is to have it in a bigger degree, but we can understand to some extent, because it's the quality of wisdom, not the quality of folly or the quality of stupidity that he has. It's the quality of wisdom, and that he has in a more imminent way. So I have a slightly different and more precise account than Aquinas of what this consists in, but the basic idea is the same. We do use words of God. We can't help using ordinary human words. We have to understand that God's goodness isn't quite the same as ours, but it's very similar and bigger.
Okay, thank you very much. Concerning the book entitled The Christian God, I would like to ask you, what reason is there for supposing God to be the traditional Christian God?
Well, I take this in two stages, if I may. First, there are arguments for the existence of God, understood as omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and perfectly free, that is to say, not influenced by irrational influences from outside. And from that it follows that he will be perfectly good. Now, the arguments for this are the arguments of natural theology, arguments from the very nature of the world itself. And these arguments have been around ever since the Greeks, but you will find them, as St. Paul refers to, he says, anyone can know there's a God simply by studying the natural world. And he comments in his letter to the Romans that the pagans, people who didn't believe that there was one God, are at fault because we can see that there's a God from the natural world. Now, put in terms of our knowledge of the natural world, we know that the natural world is governed by scientific laws. For example, there is the law of gravity, that all bodies attract each other with a force proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of their distance apart. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means every body, every chunk of matter in the universe, every atom attracts every other atom in just the same way, right? Now, think about it that way. It would be quite extraordinary if that had happened by chance, that every atom would behave in exactly the same way. But if there's a God in charge, there's he would, by definition of the sort of hypothesis we're considering, he'd be able to do that. He would be able to make atoms all behave in the same way. Why should he do so? Well, humans are a good thing, for reasons I've already mentioned. We have free choices, we can enjoy life, we can suffer, we can give, we can take, we can share in God's plan. We're a good thing. But if we are to make a difference to the world has to be a regular place. I can't either benefit or hurt you unless there's something I can do with my body which I know will benefit you. I can't give you a present if I take it and hand it over to you and it suddenly disappears. There has to be regularity. It has to stay put. And when I pass it over, it has to stay there. And likewise, unless fire behaved in a regular way, I couldn't have a choice between using a fire to burn the crops of my enemies or using the fire to cook my meals. It's because fire behaves in a regular and predictable way that I can make a difference to the world. And if there are scientific laws, then I can learn about them. And I can learn, therefore, that if I do this, that will follow. And these regularities in the universe, to which I've commented about how fire behaves and how solid objects behave, follow from the basic regularities that scientists are discovering. For example, that every atom attracts every other atom. It's because every atom attracts every other atom that this doesn't vanish, that it stays put. So God has a reason for producing regular scientific laws and making every atom behave in the same way. But if there is no God, there's no reason why that should happen. And not merely does God have that reason, the laws of nature are not merely just regular behaving laws, they are laws which lead to the evolution of human bodies in the course of many millennia. And God's reason for doing that is we're a good thing, and therefore he must make the natural world not merely so that it's orderly, but so that its order is such as to throw up us. Now, scientists have told us in recent years that the laws of nature are such that they are very finely tuned. That is to say, if the gravitational constant, the constant in the law of gravity, which says that the force between bodies is g, that's the number, times the masses of the bodies divided by the square of their distance apart. If g was a tiny bit different from its value of, in certain units, 30, if it was 29 or 31, then the law of gravity would not lead to the evolution of humans. And likewise for the constants in other laws, or in terms of the initial state, which we now believe to be a Big Bang. The universe started with a Big Bang 13.5 million years ago. If the Big Bang was 13.5 billion years ago, if the Big Bang was a tiny bit bigger, everything would have flown apart, no humans. If it was a tiny bit smaller, everything would have collapsed, no humans. But it's exactly finely tuned. Why should that be? If it was a chance matter, not the slightest reason for supposing it, but God has a reason for supposing it. So there are good arguments from the natural world to suppose there is a God in charge. Now, your question, coming round to it at last, is why should we suppose it to be the Christian God? Well, the Christian God does have just these characteristics: omnipotence, omniscience, perfect freedom. And I suggested perfect goodness follows from that, and so it does for this reason. An omniscient being is a being, by definition, who knows everything and will therefore know what is good and what is bad. You can't recognize something as good unless you have an inclination to do it. We humans recognize something as good, have an inclination to do it, but we're also subject to irrational influences which lead us to do something else. But God, by definition, is perfectly free and therefore not subject to irrational influence, so recognizing something as good, he will do it. So, by nature, he is good, and so he will seek to bring about this sort of a universe. And that is the basic answer as to why we should believe in the Christian God. It does explain why there's a universe with these characteristics, which would be very surprising indeed if that were not the case.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to remind the audience that you wrote 2 books about whether Jesus was God. One of them is a real question, was Jesus God? And the other one, the resurrection of God, the incarnate. And I would like to tell us why we should expect God to become incarnate and live in a human life. And another question, if I can ask you both of them, why we should expect him to rise from death, and there is a good historical evidence for this?
Yes, this is central to Christian view of God as opposed to the Islamic view or Jewish view of God, that God became incarnate, that is to say, took a human nature and lived on earth for 30 years. And did various things, was crucified, and rose from the dead 3 days later. That is central to the Christian doctrine.
Yes.
Now, why should we believe this? Well, first, I think we should think about the very nature of God himself. I have suggested to you that God makes us suffer, for good reasons, certainly, but he makes us suffer. Now, if if a parent makes a child suffer for good reason, and sometimes we have to do that, we have to make a child suffer if they have to go and undergo a painful operation, or we have for their sake, or we make children suffer sometimes for the sake of others. We say you've got to give some of your food away to someone who hasn't got food. So parents rightly make their children suffer to some extent for their good or the good of others. Well, God, as I pictured him, makes us suffer bigger ways sometimes for our good and for the good of others. And there comes a time where if you make someone suffer for a good purpose, you have to suffer with them. And so God, who makes us suffer, we may expect that he will come and suffer with us and therefore take a human nature. If he does, he comes to show us how to live. He comes to offer us a perfect life so that we can say to God after the event, look, I'm sorry we have led the sort of lives we have, but would you accept that life, the life of God incarnate, instead of our life? He will come to earth to reveal things to us, to show us truths. Now, if God comes to earth for this purpose, we would expect him to come as a prophet who would live a certain sort of life, who would lead a difficult life, a hard life that involves the suffering that we suffer. It will be a life in which he shows us how to live and teach us good things. So let's look around to see among the prophets from who have founded religions, if any of them have these characteristics. And sure, of course, Jesus does. Perhaps he isn't the only one. But we'd also expect him to tell us that he's God incarnate, or at any rate to show us he believed this, and to tell us that his life was an atonement for our sins. And I think Jesus did make it clear to us that he thought he was God incarnate, and he certainly said he was making atonement for our sins. Now, if he is to lead a life of suffering, to show us how to suffer, the paradigm example of this would be a life which ended in an unjust death. And of course, the life of Jesus was just that. So before we ever look at the historical evidence for the resurrection, we've got reason to suppose that God might become incarnate in the sort of way that Jesus became incarnate. But of course, God has got to show us that it's he who's done that, and that means the life has to be culminated by a miracle which is something that God alone can do, and that would be God's signature on the life. And if Jesus did indeed rise from the dead in the way that the Gospels state, it would be just that sort of signature. So in advance of the historical evidence, there's only one candidate in human history who satisfies the sort of demands which we would expect God to manifest in becoming incarnate, and we would expect that candidate to be the one on whom God put his signature. Given that, we wouldn't expect too much. You'd need too much historical evidence that he rose from the dead, but in fact we've got plenty. First, clearly the tomb on the third day was empty, because even the Jews recognized this. In St. Matthew's Gospel it said the Jews claimed that the disciples had stolen the body, but they wouldn't even claim that unless the tomb was empty. And secondly, many different people claimed to have talked to and interacted with the risen Jesus after his resurrection. It wasn't just they'd seen someone in the distance that they took to be Jesus. It's they'd had a long conversation with him, and not just one person, but several. So, and as a result of this, they were prepared to die for their faith, so they really did believe in it. So I think there is substantial evidence that God put his signature on the life of Jesus, and we would expect God to have become incarnate in this way. So we have good reason to believe that Jesus was God incarnate who rose from the dead.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we ran out of time. And I strongly hope that we will have another opportunity to discuss about your books and about the translations of your books that were coordinated in Romania by one of my colleagues, Professor George Lazaroiu. And thank you again for your interesting speech you delivered last Friday, and see you soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear Professor Richard Swinburne, thank you very much for allowing me to continue our discussion about your activity. And I would like to start asking you, how did you come writing books on philosophy?
Well, I was always interested in big questions, big metaphysical questions, such as do we have free will, what is the relation of mind and body, and of course, is there a God? And I have a natural interest in these questions, but I am also, has always been, a religious person. And when I was young, it struck me that although then, in England, quite a few people, 20%, 30% perhaps, went to church and had a religious connection, the church didn't take seriously the achievements of modern knowledge. It didn't take seriously the fact that there was a certain, let's say, incompatibility, but modern knowledge was saying all our morality is produced by our environment. We are not spiritual beings. We are just complicated machines. Religion is just something that people invent, and there's no reason for believing there's a God. And this is what the intellectual people were saying, and the church wasn't paying any attention to this. It just said, oh, well, there are different views, and this is our view. And that seemed to me very wrong of the church not to take modern knowledge seriously. And I thought that I could do something to help in this situation, because I liked big questions, but I also liked the discovery that philosophy was examining questions with very careful and rigorous arguments, or shall we say, the style of philosophy which was emerging in the English-speaking world was one which went in for careful and rigorous argument and paid serious attention to modern science. Most philosophers were certainly atheists and were using their techniques to justify the view that there was no God and that humans were just complicated machines. But I thought that the kinds of argument they were using and the kinds of writers they were referring to could be used to show a quite different result. And it was that led me into going into the big problems about, philosophical problems about religion, because I thought that the casual attitude to modern knowledge and the view that there weren't any good arguments for the existence of God was a very sad feature of modern religion. I think that for the first 1800 years of Christianity, people had believed that there are good arguments for the existence of God, and that particularly Christian doctrines could be defended by rational reasoning. But with the 19th century, there were various influences to which Christian thinking succumbed, philosophical influences from Hume and Kant, the influence of the Darwinian theory of evolution, which led religion to become very defensive and said, well, we can't deal with these problems, but still this is our view. And that seemed to me, if taken seriously and go on for a few centuries, would lead to the end of religion. But I thought there were good arguments for the existence of God, and that Hume and Kant had produced bad arguments to the contrary, and that the Darwinian theory of evolution wasn't particularly relevant, because even if humans had indeed, and I think they have, evolved as a long process over the past 13.5 billion years, the more interesting question is whether God is responsible for this process or whether it's the ultimate cause. So the fact of evolution doesn't make any difference to whether or not God is responsible for our existence. Anyway, I thought I really needed to understand modern science before I could comment on its relation to Christianity. So for the first 10 years of my philosophical career, I didn't write about religion at all. I wrote 2 or 3 books about the philosophy of science. My first book was on space and time, which is all these topics are very interesting on their own merit, quite apart from their relation to religion. And this book was largely about the relevance of the general theory of relativity to our ordinary understanding of space and time. But in due course, I moved on and then I wrote a book called Introduction to Confirmation Theory in 1973. Confirmation theory is a study of what's evidence for what kind of evidence supports this theory and what kind of evidence supports that theory. This is a problem for science, a problem for detectives, a problem for historians, and so on. So there are certain general standards here. And I like to think I elucidated those standards in this book, and indeed put them in a formal way, which is, in terms of a formal theory, which some of your readers may know, is called Bayes' theorem. But having got hold of this, I then applied it to religion, and I claimed that the arguments for the existence of God were good arguments by these impartial standards of what's evidence for what. And that's led me into books about what God is like, what we can know about him, and so on. And among that, I've written also on other topics in the meantime of not particularly immediate religious importance, such as the nature of knowledge and the nature of rationality. But my latest book is about mind and its relation to brain and free will. And it does concern, in the end, a matter of crucial importance for religion, because the Christian religion believes that there's 2 parts to us, body and soul, and the soul is the essential non-material part. And it believes also that humans have free will. It's up to us what we do. And if we were just bodies and it wasn't up to us what we do, then there would be no prospect of life after death, and we can't help what we do, so it wouldn't matter what we did because we couldn't help it. And God would certainly not be justified in punishing us for doing bad or rewarding us for doing good. So it's rather important for Christianity that we have a right view of human nature, and that's what this latest book's about.
Okay, before talking about your latest book, I would like to ask you how different people react to your books when they read them, and you were visiting professor at different universities
Yes.
around the world, so in different societies. How all these people react to your books, if you
Yes,
know
indeed.
the
Well,
reactions?
unsurprisingly, different people have had different reactions. Some like them, some don't. As I emphasized before, I am very much in the Anglo-American tradition of careful philosophical argument, making my starting point clear, making my procedures of inference clear, paying careful attention to the latest results of physics and neuroscience. And therefore, although most eminent philosophers in Britain and America do not agree with my conclusions, they can appreciate and do appreciate that I have produced arguments of a sort that hadn't occurred to them for the truths of religion, which they had otherwise just thought weren't worth even considering. So I hope I am an acceptable member of the Anglo-American philosophical community, and they appreciate that I have added something to the topics on which they work. And it has been a feature of my life and something I'm very grateful for, not just as a result of me, but of some other people, that while 50 years ago religion wasn't even discussed in philosophy departments, now there are courses on the philosophy of religion in almost all British and American universities, not necessarily compulsory parts of the philosophy course, but optional and taken by many students. And some of the teachers are atheists and some are believers, some of the students are atheists and some of the believers, but these matters are discussed in a serious way, which they were not before. That's the philosophy side of the reaction. The theology side, I'm afraid, has been less encouraging, though encouraging all the same. Theology in the English-speaking and indeed in the French and German-speaking world has been greatly influenced by the kind of philosophy which has been done in France and Germany in recent years, itself due to the influence of Kant very much. And theologians of recent years have taken the view that religion doesn't need arguments, religion doesn't need to interact with the modern world, it has its own justification, and that has nothing to do with what science has or hasn't achieved. And many theologians have felt that giving arguments for the existence of God or trying to make clear what is involved in the existence of God is somehow denigrating, doesn't appreciate the deeply metaphorical, poetic nature of religious discussion. And although I understand that, I do think that that attitude is not typical of the first 1800 years of Christianity, and I do think that it would lead to the end of religion if it were carried on indefinitely. So some theologians, I like to think, have begun to appreciate what I have been trying to do, but some of them don't regard it as sufficiently, quote, religious. And it's because of this philosophical division and this odd business that Anglo-American philosophy has been more influenced by continental French and German philosophy than by English philosophy, that my ideas have not been immediately received very well or received at all on the continent of Europe, because there's this great division between, or has been until recently, between philosophy as it's done in the English-speaking world and philosophy as it's done in France, Italy, Spain, and so on. But this division is beginning to come to an end, actually. And although 30 years ago people in France or Germany would have paid no attention to not merely my writing, but almost anything written in about philosophy for or against religion in the English-speaking world, that attitude is changing. And I'm very glad to say my books are now being translated into French and German and Spanish and so on, and that is very welcome. But the reception has obviously been very much greater in the English-speaking world.
Okay, thank you very much for all these details. Now, if you won't mind, I would like to discuss about your latest book called Mind, Brain and Free Will. And I have two questions for this. And first of them is, are we merely complicated machine or souls interacting with bodies?
Yes, many philosophers are physicalists, that's to say. They think that we are just machines, and that's all there is to it. But now, firstly, if I may introduce a little philosophical terminology, we must distinguish between a substance and its properties. What I mean by a substance is an individual thing. This desk is a substance, this person is a substance, this building is a substance. And substances have properties. This desk has the property of being that shape. It has the property of being blue. It has the property of being plastic, and so on. Right. Now, human beings, according to the extreme physicalist, are both physical substances, that is to say, they just occupy space, and they are all the only properties they have are physical properties. Now, I understand by a physical property one which is publicly observable, which anyone can detect as well as anyone else, being that shape is a physical property because we can all see it. And this thing is a physical thing because it has nothing but physical properties. It's made up of shape, color, and so on, which we can all see. Now, human beings quite obviously have some physical properties. I have such and such a mass, such and such a shape. But I have also got, quite obviously, non-physical properties, mental properties. Now, a mental property is a property such that one person has a way of knowing about it that others don't. I have a way of knowing about my sensations, whether I'm in pain or not, whether there's a color of blue in my visual field, my thoughts, my beliefs, my desires, my intentions. How are you? Well, you can find out about these to some extent by watching my behavior, perhaps even by looking at my brain. But I could find out about these things by watching a film of my behavior, looking at my brain through some complicated way. But I have a way of knowing about them which is not available to anyone else. And this is the first point to make against the physicalist. We quite obviously have some mental properties, and these are properties to which we have privileged access. And it's very difficult indeed to deny that. Now, that means that extreme physicalism is completely impossible. We've now reached the stage that is often called property dualism. That is to say, some moderate physicalists will admit that, well, human beings have mental properties as well as physical properties, but they want to say that human beings are physical substances in this sense, that there isn't any part of me which is purely mental, and that the properties that make me me are just physical. The mental are sort of peripheral, unimportant. Now that too must be wrong, because you couldn't describe everything in the world simply by saying that, well, there were these physical things to which we have public access, and these things have mental properties. Because if I knew all about you and about everyone else, what physical properties you had and what mental properties you had, there'd still be something missing. For example, there would be a difference. The world would be quite different if you had this body and I had that body. But nevertheless, if all the truths about the world were simply truths about what physical substances there are and what mental properties are connected with it, then there wouldn't be any difference between me having this body and you having that body, and the other way around. So, in order to state that truth, we need to suppose that there is something else that makes me me other than the physical bits, because we could know what would happen to the physical bits and not know what happened by me. And this can be brought out in an extreme way when we consider the possibility of brain transplants. Neuroscientists are hard at work discovering what happens in our brains and also trying to manipulate them. Now, suppose the future neuroscientist, and this may sound like just a scientific bit of fiction, but it may happen one day. Suppose the neuroscientist gets hold of my brain, takes it out of my body, cuts it into two, and suppose there's a clone of me, and so he gets hold of the clone and he takes out the bits as well. And suppose he takes out your brain and puts half of my brain in there and half of my clone's brain in there. And suppose he takes another person and takes out their brain and puts another half of my brain in there and another part of the clone's brain in there. What's happened to me? Now, both of these subsequent persons would have half of my brain, so it would be reasonable to expect, because information is, whatever beliefs I have, the brain bases of them are in both parts of the hemisphere, it would be reasonable to expect that each of these persons would claim to be me. They would each say that they had had my past life. They wouldn't claim to remember everything, but they would claim to remember enough so that in normal circumstances we would judge them to be me. But they can't both be me, because they now have different lives. They leave the room by different doors. And if they were both me, they would be the same as each other, and they're not. If A is the same as B and B is the same as C, then A is the same as C. But in this case, A is not the same as C. So, which is me? And what is evident is that we could know everything about what's happened to every atom of me. These atoms are there, those atoms are there. We could know everything about what experiences these people are having, and yet we wouldn't know which is me. And that brings out that being me is something extra. And the extra something is not a matter of what experiences these people are having, it's a matter of who is having these experiences. And so being me can't just be a matter of the physical stuff, because if it was a matter of the physical stuff and we knew all that had happened to the physical stuff, we'd have known what happened to me, but we don't, and therefore there must be an extra bit which constitutes me. And that's the first thing I have tried to establish, and I think this is incontrovertible, but not everybody agrees yet. There is an essential non-physical part of me. And that we do have souls, and the souls are what make us. And at death, of course, body and soul come apart. and it's because there's a soul that God can, if he chooses, keep it alive and give it a new body in the world to come. But if there wasn't a soul, there wouldn't be anything that God could give life to.
Okay, thank you very much. Because there is not so much time, I would like to ask you a last question. Do we have free will in a sense which makes us morally responsible for our actions?
I think we do. The argument has two parts, or my argument for this has two parts. First, it's the physicalist will tell you we do what we do because of what happens in our brain, and what happens in our brain is caused by what earlier happens in our brain, and that's caused by all sorts of physical things. Now that can't be the whole truth. It certainly doesn't look like the whole truth. It looks as if what happens in my brain might cause my sensations and thoughts and feelings and so on, but then I think about things and I make a decision to do this rather than that, and what I do is a matter of my decision, not a matter of just what goes on in the brain. Even if, and I don't admit this, even if the decision were entirely caused by brain goings on. Various neuroscientists have tried to show otherwise. They have tried to show that various things, brain states cause behavior without people's intentions being involved. But the sort of experiments they have done to show that depend on them trying to show, not yet very successfully, trying to show that goings on in the brain would be the same whether or not I had formed an intention to do something. But the evidence they produce for that, the only evidence they could produce for that, showing that these things happen whether or not an intention occurs. But in order to show that, they've got to know that an intention occurs on some occasion and doesn't make a difference. And how do they know whether the intention occurs on that occasion? Well, because subjects tell them, the subjects they're experimenting on, they tell them that I formed such and such an intention. And then the experimenter can show that a certain brain sequence occurs whether or not, both when they did claim to form an intention and when they didn't. But why should we believe what subjects tell us about what their intentions are? Well, we believe them because we believe that they are trying to tell us when they had an intention, that they believe they had the intention, and they are trying to tell us that. So we believe them because we believe the words that come out of their mouths are caused by their beliefs and intentions. So the only way they can prove that our intentions don't make a difference to what we do is by relying on evidence which assumes that our intentions do make a difference to what they do, so the program is self-defeating. So we are back with what obviously seems to be the case, that our decisions do make a difference. Now, the question arises then as to whether our decisions themselves are caused, and if you were to show that, you would have to show innumerable scientific laws connecting each type of decision and each type of belief and so on with our actions. And I don't think for a moment you can have this for many reasons. But one reason is just this. Scientific laws are mathematical laws. They say that an increase of 10% in this quantity will lead to an increase of 20% in that quantity. They are relations between measurable quantities. You can't measure degrees of mental events. We can measure public events, but we can't measure the degree of an intention or the strength of a sensation, and therefore the program is doomed to failure.
Yeah, I'm afraid we don't have enough time for more discussions, and I would like to invite you to explain the other reasons next time, maybe when you will be guest to our university. And I want to thank you very much for being our guest. And I personally want to thank to the director of boards of directors and my colleagues
And
for
thank you very
supporting
much.
me in organizing
Thank
this.
you very much for allowing me to present my views on Romanian television, and I am grateful for my hosts here in their hospitality and readiness to listen to them.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Swinburne.